A medic drops beside a chest wound in the rice paddy mud, and the man under his hands is already reaching for his aid bag, already begging for the needle. Doc has 5 morphine syrettes clipped inside his kit, enough to knock out a mule, and he does not touch a single one. He presses his palm flat against the wound, leans in close, and says the wound is bad, but the fix is easy. Then he reaches into his own pocket, not the aid bag, and drops 2 small pieces of candy into the wounded man's palm. "Pain pills," he says. "Swallow them now, the chopper's coming." The soldier does exactly that, and inside of a minute, he swears the pain is already backing off. This is the file on the strangest medicine of the Vietnam War, the wounds where morphine was against the rules, and the candy that medics learned to use instead. Over the next few minutes, we're getting into why an army that issued morphine by the crate would still forbid a medic from using it, what actually happens inside a wounded man's body when the wrong painkiller meets the wrong wound, and the genuine, documented science going back to a beach in Italy in World War II that explains why a fistful of M&Ms could actually work. Quick favor before we get into it. If this kind of history is your thing, a like and a subscribe go a long way, and if you've got a minute, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Start with the drug itself. Morphine tartrate came to Vietnam in a syrette, a collapsible metal tube about the size of a tube of toothpaste with a fixed needle on the end, built so a medic, or a soldier treating himself, could jab it into a thigh one-handed and squeeze. One syrette held half a grain, roughly 16 milligrams. It was fast, it was reliable, and every grunt in a rifle platoon had at least a passing familiarity with what it felt like to watch it work on a friend. Medics carried theirs stuffed into a canvas aid bag alongside battle dressings, gauze, and a grease pencil. And that grease pencil mattered as much as the syrette itself. Every time morphine went into a man, the medic wrote a capital M on his forehead, in blood if nothing else was handy, along with the time. It was a chart with no paper, a warning to the next set of hands that reached this casualty, because giving a second full dose to a man who already had one in him was its own way to kill him. That marking system existed because morphine is not a gentle drug. It is a respiratory depressant first and a painkiller second, meaning its real, measurable effect on the body is to slow the drive to breathe. In a healthy man resting in a hospital bed, that side effect is manageable. In a 19-year-old with a sucking chest wound, already fighting to keep air moving through a hole that shouldn't be there, morphine can push him past the point where his body remembers to breathe on its own. Add a head wound to the picture, and the drug becomes even more dangerous because it also blunts the exact signs, level of consciousness, pupil response, breathing rate, that a doctor further down the evacuation chain needs to read in order to know how bad the brain injury actually is. Mask those signs with a narcotic, and you haven't treated the man, you've made him harder to diagnose. And in a man already in hemorrhagic shock, blood pressure crashing from blood loss, morphine's tendency to relax blood vessels can drop that pressure even further, tipping a survivable wound into a fatal one. Army field medicine doctrine of the era was blunt about it. Chest wounds, head wounds, abdominal wounds, and shock were the 4 flags that meant a medic had to withhold the syrette no matter how loud the man was screaming for it, which left medics with a genuine problem that no amount of training solved. They had a wounded, terrified soldier in front of them, sometimes for the 20, 30, 40 minutes it took a dust-off helicopter to arrive. And they had orders not to give him the one thing he was begging for. Doing nothing wasn't really an option either, because fear and pain together drive up heart rate and blood pressure in ways that can make a marginal wound worse. Medics needed something to hand a man, something physical he could hold on to and believe in, that would calm him down without touching his breathing, his blood pressure, or the symptoms a surgeon still needed to see. And it turned out the U.S. military had already been mass-producing exactly that kind of object for 20 years, just not for this reason. M&Ms exist because of the Spanish Civil War. Forrest Mars Sr. was traveling through Spain in the 1930s and noticed soldiers there eating small pellets of chocolate with a hard sugar shell, a coating that let the candy survive heat without melting in a man's hand or pocket. Mars brought the idea home, partnered with Bruce Murray, son of the Hershey Chocolate Company's president, and in 1941 the two of them patented and launched M&Ms, the name built from their own initials. The timing could not have been better for the U.S. Army. Chocolate that didn't melt in a soldier's pack in tropical or desert heat was a logistics dream. And once the country entered World War II, Mars directed the company's entire production run to the American Armed Forces. GIs came home from that war having developed a genuine attachment to the candy, which is a large part of why it became a fixture of American shelves afterward. And by the time Vietnam rolled around a generation later, M&Ms were everywhere in a soldier's world, tucked into C-ration accessory packets, mailed from home in care packages, sitting in cargo pockets and aid bags alongside bandages and salt tablets. A medic reaching for M&Ms wasn't reaching for something exotic. He was reaching for the most familiar piece of candy in the entire theater. What makes the story more than just battlefield folklore is that a real doctor had already run something close to this exact experiment and written it up. Henry K. Beecher was an American anesthesiologist who served with U.S. Army forces in Italy during World War II. And, as the story he later told it, at a field hospital near the Anzio beachhead, the supply of morphine ran out while wounded men kept arriving. Rather than tell a badly wounded soldier that there was nothing left for his pain, medical staff reportedly injected him with ordinary saline solution and told him it was morphine. According to Beecher's own account, this worked far more often than anyone expected, easing real, reported pain in wounded men who had no idea they'd been given salt water. Beecher carried that observation into civilian medicine and became one of the founding figures of modern placebo research, publishing his landmark 1955 paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association titled The Powerful Placebo, in which he reviewed more than a dozen clinical studies and estimated that roughly a third of a treatment's apparent success could come from the patient's own expectation of relief rather than the treatment itself. It's worth being straight with you that some medical historians have since gone digging for a primary source that directly confirms the Anzio battlefield story exactly as it's usually told, and haven't been able to pin one down in Beecher's own papers. So the anecdote itself sits somewhere between documented history and a doctor's well-worn story about his own war. What isn't in dispute is Beecher's broader body of placebo research and the decades of controlled studies it kicked off. Modern medicine has since gone a long way past Beecher's 1955 estimate, and this is where the science actually gets solid. Researchers using an opioid-blocking drug called naloxone, the same medication used today to reverse an overdose, found that they could partially cancel out a placebo's pain-relieving effect by administering naloxone alongside it. That result mattered enormously, because it meant the placebo effect wasn't purely psychological in some vague sense. When a person genuinely expects pain relief, their brain releases its own natural opioids, endogenous chemicals chemically related to morphine itself. And those homemade opioids bind to the same receptors a syrette would target. Naloxone blocks that receptor regardless of whether the opioid came from a needle or from the brain's own chemistry, which is why it dulls both. In other words, when a Vietnam medic told a wounded man that what he was swallowing was a pain pill and the man believed him, that belief could trigger a real, physically measurable release of the body's own morphine-like chemicals. It wasn't only in his head, it was, quite literally, in his bloodstream. That naloxone finding didn't stay a laboratory curiosity either. Over the following decades, researchers kept refining it, running brain imaging studies that showed the same regions lighting up under a placebo painkiller as under a real one, and confirming again and again in study after study that a patient's simple belief that relief is coming can measurably change activity in the parts of the brain that process pain. None of that was available to a medic kneeling in a paddy in 1968. He didn't have a journal article in his aid bag, and he almost certainly never heard Beecher's name. What he had was years of watching wounded men respond to confidence, a calm voice, something solid placed in their hand. The science just happened to catch up to what plenty of medics had already worked out by instinct. Now picture it happening. You are 19 years old, you've been in country 4 months, and a burst of shrapnel has just opened your side. You're on your back in wet grass with your platoon's return fire cracking somewhere behind you, and every breath drags. Doc is already kneeling over you, hands moving fast, packing the wound, and you can see the aid bag hanging off his shoulder, can see the shape of a syrette through the canvas, and you ask him for it, plainly, because you've seen what it does for other men. He shakes his head once. Chest wound, he tells you, can't give it, it'll shut your breathing down. You don't fully understand the physiology, and you don't need to, because right then he's already digging into his own pocket, past the aid bag entirely, and pulling out a small paper tube of M&Ms. He shakes 2 into your palm, closes your fingers around them himself, and tells you, flat and certain, that these are the pain pills, swallow them now, the bird's inbound. You believe him, because in that moment you have absolutely no reason not to, and you put them in your mouth. The candy shell dissolves fast against the dry inside of your cheek. Somewhere behind your fear, your brain has already started keeping its half of the bargain, and by the time you hear the rotor wash of the dust-off coming in low over the tree line, you'd swear the pain has eased, just a little, just enough to hang on. That kind of improvisation wasn't limited to candy standing in for morphine. Vietnam-era medics became known for stretching whatever was in reach past its intended purpose, sealing small wounds shut with cyanoacrylate glue, the same chemical family as household superglue, when sutures weren't practical in the field. The M&M's trick fits into that same tradition, a battlefield workaround built from nothing but a familiar object and an understanding, half instinct and half remembered training, of what a frightened, wounded man actually needed in the minutes before real help arrived. None of this ever made it into an official field manual. There was no regulation instructing a medic to substitute candy for narcotics, no line item for it in a supply requisition. It passed the way most combat medicine folklore passes, medic to medic, unit to unit, corpsman teaching the trick to the new 18-year-old who just checked into the platoon. Until it became one of those unwritten rules that everyone who served alongside a good medic seemed to know about. And in a strange way, the modern military has come back around to something close to the same idea. Current battlefield medicine doctrine, built around programs like tactical combat casualty care, spends real time training medics and corpsmen not just in when to give a narcotic, but in the verbal and psychological techniques for calming a wounded man down. Because a lower heart rate and steadier breathing genuinely improve his odds, regardless of what drug, if any, is in his system. The candy is gone from the modern kit. The underlying instinct that what you tell a wounded man matters almost as much as what you give him never left. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the small, human, unofficial details that never made it into the official record, stick around and subscribe, because there's a lot more of it waiting. Leave a comment and tell me if you've ever heard a version of this story, or if you know a medic who carried something similar in his aid bag. And if you know someone who'd get a kick out of this one, send it their way. To every medic and corpsman who reached into his own pocket instead of his aid bag and made a scared, wounded kid believe, even for a few minutes, that he was going to be all right. This one was for you.